Welcome back, guys. It's your boy Gats. If you go on to like this video, be sure to hit the like and subscribe. Oh, excuse me, I had something in my throat there. This is my 2001 Jaguar XJR. Today we have a video I'm actually somewhat excited for. The Jaguar hit the dyno. It actually hit the dyno about 2023, but I'm really backlogged with the videos that I'm making here. To put it into perspective, I'm recording this dialogue in January 2026, probably a couple weeks before you actually see the full video. A couple things you may notice right off the bat: the vehicle is covered in a blanket of dust, and a cherry picker has found a home being stored beneath the car. All of this should indicate that the car has not been driven in a while. Today we're going to talk about the dyno experience, how everything went down. I'm going to show you the footage of the car on the dyno, and then we're going to cut an engine oil filter open to assess if the vehicle received any internal damage from the dyno, because for those who don't know, the dyno can make or break vehicles. First, we're going to talk about what we expect to see on the dyno, and we'll start by covering horsepower specs. This beautiful car made about 370 horsepower from the factory. But they're liars. The engine made about 370 horsepower from the factory, which lose about 30% of your horsepower through the torque converter, transmission, drive shaft, differential, and then the independent axles going to either end of the wheel groups. If you look back at the era where this car was being built, there was a race to have the most powerful luxury saloon in Europe. Safe to say the Jaguar lost this race. But one of the biggest contenders in that race was obviously the mighty E39 M5, which was also guilty of this sin because they said the car made 400 horsepower, then on a dyno it made about 330. On average. I will point out that the E39 was the last car in BMW's M car lineup to have this treatment. Every current M car that they have has wheel horsepower, and it's usually undersold by about 5%, but it isn't every vehicle. My 760 here claimed to make about 448 horsepower, and I've seen very few videos of cars on the dyno, but they've all made exactly that. However, the G11 M760, the last V12 BMW that they actually made, claimed to make about 605, but ends up putting about 570 up, so it's not across the board that this applies. That being said, it's not so cut and dry because some manufacturers will undersell the engine horsepower, which means if you were to just take 30% off what the actual engine produced and assume that that's what it's making at the wheels, you may be off in that regard too. The next thing I'll mention is very specific to this engine here. It's something that I looked out for when I bought this vehicle, but it's an oversight for almost anyone who gives you a buyer's guide for one of these vehicles, and it's something you should look out for if you're interested in buying one of these vehicles. The 1998 XJR was an oddball compared to the rest of the XJRs. I've mentioned in the past that a lot of these cooling system lines were different in that car. They've changed that. The only one that sticks out in my head is they had a different mass airflow sensor, and I'm sure they had a lot of other different parts. 1999 might be the same, but what we're going to talk about is the difference between a 1999 and a 2000. When these cars came out in 1998, they had a crucial flaw. And that flaw is known as Nikosil cylinder liners. The engine blocks on these are made of aluminum, I believe, but I will fact check that during the editing process. But they put a spray-on coating of Nikosil on the liners to get the last couple thousands of material on the cylinder walls. I'm going to change directions here and talk about different cars that have Nikosil cylinder liners. A 2005 Porsche Cayenne Turbo had a 4.2 liter turbocharged crossplane V8. Awesome. Problem with them: Nikosil cylinder liners. Once you passed 100,000 kilometers or something around that regard, the Nikosil cylinder liners had worn away to the point where there was so much clearance in the cylinders that, for one, the car made no compression, and for two, it actually got bad enough to the point where the wrist pins would come loose and it would throw rods out the side of the engine. Catastrophic engine failure. And that's why you can get one for super cheap, but I can't bring myself to start that project. Way too expensive and not enough to gain. However, they sound amazing. The 1998 Jaguar had cylinder walls lined with Nikosil. From what I've seen, these engines are actually still very robust. I've never seen one catastrophically fail as a result of this. However, they do suffer from poor cylinder compression. The poor cylinder compression is a lot more vital when you're running boost. That being said, when you look at videos of these cars on the dyno, I've seen quite a handful of cars that are putting out numbers around 250 to 270 horsepower. That's like over 100 horsepower lost. However, in 2000, they went away from the Nikosil cylinder liners. This is a 2001, meaning that this engine will not suffer from poor compression issues like the previous engines did. So when looking at videos of cars that are being put on the dyno, first things first, you have to separate the cars that are from 1998 to 1999 from the cars that are 2000 plus. However, some cars in the 2000 range still had Nikosil liners. It's probably about halfway through 2000 they actually made the switch over. So if you factor in the year of your vehicle into your research, you'll find that a a lot of the post-2000 cars made north of 300 horsepower. And for the record, this is a completely stock engine aside from this Mina Gallery aluminum intake. So that's a benchmark for what we expect to see here. That being said, let's move on to the dyno experience. Every June or July, there's a company that I used to work pretty closely with. They host a car show. And now they have a contractor company that they work closely with, and they bring in a trailer dyno every year. And at this point, I had done so much maintenance on the vehicle that I actually thought it was safe and that it may actually survive the dyno. I filled out some paperwork that basically said, will the car explode on the dyno? And the answer was no to most of those questions. I changed the engine oil before setting it on the dyno. Any contamination you have in your engine oil under full load of the engine is going to be forced into the bearings of the crank journal. So it's good to have just as clean engine oil as you possibly can. Transmission oil had been changed very recently before that, and the diff oil had been changed a couple of years ago. I actually volunteered to work this event too. I was working with the dyno guys. Basically, we were driving vehicles onto the dyno, then we would strap them down, tying down the suspension components from the rear axle, as well as in the front. The front was just tied around the rims, I believe, and a large cooling fan was positioned in the front of the car to make sure you had sufficient air going through your radiator. When my car went on the dyno, obviously I was operating the car, and as a result, I had other people that were tying my vehicle down. The first thing I did when the car was on the dyno, it had been sitting in the lot, so the engine was actually cold. So once rolling on the dyno, I just held it at lower RPMs until the engine was at a sufficient temperature, just below operating temperature. You don't want to heat soak these things. If you get the engine too hot, you start losing horsepower. Once the engine was at somewhat optimal range, then you shift into fourth gear. Fourth gear is direct drive, meaning the engine and transmission are coupled at the exact same gear ratio. So you should be seeing exactly what the engine is putting out in fourth gear. Then you're directed to operate the vehicle at about 1200 RPM. During this time, their computer is kind of getting a feel, getting an understanding of your car. Once the dyno operators are comfortable with what they're seeing on the computer, then you have to go ahead to conduct your dyno run. After the run's complete, you slowly bring it to a stop. You do not hit the brakes. You will damage the dyno and probably your drivetrain in your car. And from there, they set you up to do a second pass. In this case, they actually allow you to do a full pass starting from zero. As far as I know, there's no actual benefit to this aside from the fact that it sounds really cool. So take a look. After the second pass, I don't know if I have videos that'll actually show it, but that's where we ran into a bit of a problem. Steam was coming out of the engine bay. And at the point that my mother saw this, who was watching, she said, I told him. And at this point, nobody did anything, so I actually had to call for one of my coworkers who was there to jump up and inspect and see what's actually happening, because I wasn't supposed to leave the vehicle. I was on the dyno. And the conclusion that we came to is that if you look right here, there's a bunch of discoloration around the tray that is above the exhaust manifolds. I had replaced the valve cover gaskets because they were leaking there, and I did not put silicone on the seams between the block. And as a result, it's always kind of leaked a little bit, but it leaks onto the exhaust manifold and it evaporates. So I've never been too concerned. As soon as they told me where the steam is coming from, I knew exactly what the cause of it was. Basically, because while the engine was at maximum load and you're holding the engine at 6,000 RPM, we were making so much boost that's for such a long period of time that we had so much crankcase pressure that it was forcing more oil out through there. And of course, at this point, the exhaust manifolds were glowing hot, because on a dyno, you see exhaust temperatures higher than you'll ever see in normal operations. But having an understanding of what had happened, I determined it'd be safe to do a final pass. Let's quickly talk about what we've seen while we were on the dyno. For one, you may see there's a couple little puffs of black smoke that came out of the tailpipe during the run. That was the result of us hitting the rev limiter. And we were hitting the rev limiter because this Jaguar is paired to a Mercedes transmission. The Mercedes transmission is one of the reasons I bought an XJR instead of an X308. The ZF transmissions in the XJ8 were terrible, and the Mercedes transmissions are somewhat bulletproof. Bulletproof, but garbage. They're slush boxes. They don't shift fast enough. I got a whole box full of parts up there to rebuild the valve body, and I just haven't gotten around to doing it because I have other projects that have come and gone since. But this is consistent with a lot of XJR and XKR dyno runs that you see on YouTube. Another thing that'll catch you off guard is the fact that during the dyno run, the wheel speed on the car far exceeds what your speedometer is capable of reading. Speedometer on this maxes out at 280, but it was probably running at like 340 kilometers per hour. And that's a bit alarming when you're watching your speedometer wrap past the end of the gauge. Now let's talk about what everybody wants to see. What do we got for power numbers here? On our first run, if you remember, we held it at about 1200 RPM in 4th gear until the dyno operator gave us the go ahead to make a pass. The numbers we put up were 346 horsepower at 3800 RPM with a max torque of 484 pound-feet at 3700 RPM. On our second run, which we went from 0 all the way through the entire gear range, we made 352 horsepower at 5300 RPM, and the max torque was 870 pound-feet at 950 RPM. During our third run, which followed the exact same premise, we made 353 horsepower at 5350 RPM, and our max torque was 847 pound-feet at 1150 RPM. Now let's talk about the horsepower numbers. Bear in mind that our engine is completely stock aside from that aluminum intake tube. And if you remember, the engine was supposed to make 370 horsepower from factory. That being said, we made 350 horsepower. And I mentioned earlier, we're supposed to have around 30% loss through the drivetrain. That being said, we can come to the conclusion that our engine must be making way more than 370 horsepower. The aluminum intake tube that I have on it claims that it makes around 12 horsepower just by replacing the aluminum tube. And when I bought it, I scoffed at that number. There's basically no actual change in the design. However, in the description of the part, they give you an explanation as to why they say this horsepower increase happens. They say that the factory intake has a number of bottlenecks in it, which restricts the flow going into the supercharger. And looking at it, I can't see them being this detrimental to it. However, if you watch the dyno run on Drive Tribe, which is the company that was rebuilding Richard Hammond's XJR for him, they were restoring an XKR at the same time that they were restoring Richard Hammond's Jaguar XJR. And their car was modified with a supercharger pulley overdrive, as well as a piggyback ECM that they were tuning with. I believe they made around 420 horsepower just with the backpack tune and with a supercharger overdrive. But when they removed the intake, which means they removed the plastic intake tube and they also removed the air filter itself, they made 450 horsepower. I will say that most of that horsepower gain is from removing the filter, as the filter is obviously far more of a restriction than the tubing itself is. However, that does still give some credibility to the claims of Mina Gallery. Next, we're going to talk about torque. As you can see in our first run, we made around 484 pounds of torque, which is awesome. In our second and third run, we made 870 pounds of torque. Unbelievable. But if you look very closely, you'll see some numbers that indicate there's a problem here. 3700 RPM is where our peak torque was made on the first pull, and our second pull was made at 950 RPM, and our third pull was made at 1150 RPM. The reason the second and third runs had such high torque numbers is because it was including the torque multiplication that happens in the transmission during the first, second, and third gears. That being said, those numbers mean nothing, and the first run is when it was held in 4th gear, and that'll give you the true torque numbers for the engine. And it kind of annoyed me that the person that was writing down the dyno results on a whiteboard didn't know this, so mine was listed at 480 horsepower, and the rest of the vehicles were written at double that. But whatever, I know the truth. That being said, I'm tremendously happy with the numbers that we received on the dyno. This is unfortunately where I have something I have to confess. I may have cheated. The one negative about this aluminum intake is that people have claimed that it gets very hot and is unable to dissipate the heat, and it increases the temperature of the air going into your supercharger, which actually reduces the amount of power that you actually make. And because we are at a car show, prior to us hitting the dyno, this car sat in the parking lot with the hood open and the sun beaming on that aluminum intake, and it was very hot. I had thought about this possibility prior to this, so I had gone to a 7-Eleven, bought a bag of ice, put the bag of ice in a freezer, and prior to doing the dyno run, I put the bag of ice on that aluminum intake tube. Now, there's a lot of people that have done myth busting on whether or not icing your intake tube actually increases any horsepower, and the results are no, it typically doesn't. However, I am in a different category for myth busting here, because I was in a heavy duty shop. The freezer freezer that I put the ice in was a bearing freezer, which was at minus 60 degrees Celsius. A normal freezer is about -4 to -8. That's about half of the results that you would expect to see from liquid nitrogen cooling your intake manifold, which would give you different results. However, here's where I defend myself. I put the bag of ice on the intake of my car. I then closed the hood of my car. I fired it up. I drove around to the dyno. I then shut the car off, waited for the previous person to finish on the dyno. I then threw the bag of ice into the grass beside it, drove up onto the dyno, shut the car down, waited for them to tie the vehicle down, and then fired the engine up, and then warmed the engine up to operating temperature. And if you add all that up, that was probably about 15 minutes worth of runtime, and I can't imagine the intake tube was that cold after that amount of time. I'd like to say that I gave it the best fighting chance of putting up good numbers on the dyno by doing that, so I don't regret my decision. However, I'm sure there's people in the comments that might argue that I may have cheated. And I will point out, to be fair, that the dyno numbers that I seen were higher than any dyno numbers I've ever seen for one of these XJRs stock on the internet. However, it's also possible that the dyno was reading high. I'd have to look at the numbers from other vehicles that went on the dyno that day and compare them to what they would be making stock, and then see if the dyno is reading high in that regard. But that seems like a lot of work, and I don't think I'm going to do that. And with that, now we're going to go on to the actual footage that was recorded in 2023, which is cutting an engine oil filter open to determine if we've done any damage to the engine during this dyno run. So enjoy that portion of the footage. Okay, and we're back with another video related to the 2001 Jaguar XJR. I'm recording at an undisclosed location, and I'll leave it at that. Just thought it'd be a nice idea to make a video on cutting a filter open, because I feel like that's not something everybody gets to see every day. More often than not, what you'll see on a channel like this are people inspecting cartridge filters, but when you have a spin-on filter like this, it's not as easy to inspect. The reason for cutting this filter is because this vehicle just hit the dyno 3,000 kilometers ago. The Jaguar put a healthy 350 horsepower down on the dyno, which I'm happy to report. Those numbers are significantly better than I thought I was going to get, being that they were 370 at the crank according to the factory specs. Being that generally you lose about 50 horsepower to the drivetrain friction and stuff like that, that means we're probably sitting closer to like 400 horsepower at the engine, which is actually very impressive, and I'm very happy with that number. I will note that on the dyno, I don't know if video footage is actually going to show it, but I did have a bit of a scare, because after the second or third pull, a bunch of smoke began coming from the beneath the engine bay, which turned out to just be that while holding at 6,000 RPM on the dyno, I created so much boost that I created some crankcase pressure, and it ended up shooting a little bit of oil out of the valve cover gasket onto the exhaust manifold, so it was all okay. Well, we assume it's all okay. We're about to find out when we got this thing open here. This is basically the reason I'm here, is because I do not own this tool myself. This tool basically allows you to just cut the spin-on filter open. And unfortunately, there's a machine that was recently brought into the shop, which has not had the fire suppression deactivated, and that's the beeping that you're going to hear all throughout the video, unfortunately. Basically, just add tension and keep walking this around, though. In the past 4,000 kilometers, though, this car has done a dyno run, as well as we drove out to Airdrie and picked up the 760, and the person that I was driving with, I told them to have some fun with the Jag, you know, as a treat for them, you know, driving me all the way out to Airdrie, right? Like, I guess they might as well get to have some fun, right? This engine oil filter will have picked up more material than the average one has, because I've had some fun with it. We'll note that when I drained the oil, I did see a little bit of sparkles going on there. I'll show footage of me removing the filter. And in the fluid, the sparkles almost looked like they were brass, which is always like a cause for concern. A little bit of metal should be made on the dyno, because, you know, you are testing things to the limits. You're gonna have accelerated wear. But brass you should almost never see. But I'm also not opposed to the idea that it could have been like silver particles, which are a little more expected and understandable, that were just tinted brown because of how dirty the oil was. Prior to me changing the oil, and I was skeptical of even doing this, but I put seafoam cleaner in the oil because I could tell that the engine oil system was definitely getting a little bit dirty there. I start to get a squeaking noise coming from something in the valve train when the engine oil gets really dirty. Putting seafoam in always like fixes that. I'll probably cover that in another video. My fear was that putting seafoam in, though, would compromise any results we'd get from this filter testing. We'll see how true that is. You can see how true that is just because of how thin the oil is that came out of it. So this is what to most will look a little more recognizable. This is what the typical cartridge filter looks like on any of the BMWs that we work on. The issue is you can't see it when it's inside the spin-on filter housing. I'm actually going to get a clean container and I'll come back. Clean up some residual water from the parts washer so we can have best contamination control measures for diagnostic purposes. Fuck's sakes. That oil is pretty dark. This is longer than I usually leave it. That's because I've been prioritizing other vehicles, and Figured if I'm gonna get one change out of the season, I'll get it towards the end. We do see a bit of metal in here, which is to be expected. This is probably the darkest filter I've ever cut from it, which unfortunately makes it harder to identify how many metal particles are actually in here. A lot of that black powder that we're seeing in the bottom is actually just carbon, and that's from the seafoam breaking it loose. I'm just gonna let that spring come out there. How a filter works is that the unfiltered oil is on the outside of the filter, meaning that everything we're looking at in here is unfiltered. And it does look fairly clean, which reinstates me with a bit of confidence here. A lot of carbon though. Now we usually check man filters is we just pry them apart like this, kind of look in between. Giving this a good look right off the bat. I'm gonna go ahead and say this filter sample's probably clean, but I'm gonna do an even more thorough sample just because we're here and we have the technology. One thing I will say about when you are looking in the bottom of this canister here is some of that metal will be from us cutting this here. So the fact that I see very little metal is still also very encouraging. What we're doing right now is squeezing as much of the oil out as we can so we can get as best of a look at the actual sample material. Now, I don't remember which side is which. I think I'll be able to tell just by looking. I'm gonna go ahead and say that is the clean side and this is the filtered side. So what we see there is a lot of black in the center and that's a lot of carbon. I do see some small metal particles here and there, but nothing big enough to cause general concern. Little metal fleck there, but it's painted, which tells me that it's actually part of the filter. Decent chunks of carbon. Looking at this filter though, I can say, aside from the small amounts of metal, which, you know, we were putting a lot of force on all the bearings and everything inside the lower assembly, so just a little bit of metal here does not concern me, and I think our engine's pretty healthy still. And with that, that's actually going to conclude our video, so hopefully someone learned something from this endeavor here. I'm going to clean up this mess, and then I'll go home, and fortunately, we got a good bill of health for our Jaguar XJR. Thank you for watching.